okay? So I just want to remind you of that before we get into this, in case it goes in a direction that is uncomfortable for people. Just remember, you don't have to fix it. You just have to be aware it happened and make that a part of something you're aware of, okay? So let's get into it. Let's talk about why we carve up Africa. Okay, to start with, from 500, and that should be BC, 500 BC to about 1500 CE, Africa was ruled by people from Africa, okay? Most of the empires that traded with the Mediterranean focused around the rivers, so the Niger River around this area here and the Nile River. And this, all of this area down here was the Bantu people, which were sort of tribal, sort of nomadic, not a lot of interaction with the outside world, okay? Henry the Navigator set up relationships with coastal areas, and then those coastal areas went inland and kidnapped people and sold them into slavery. But for the most part, there's very, very little European influence on the inside of Africa up to about 1500 BC, CE. And then the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic influences start to be felt creeping down into the north and around the coastal areas. So in about 1880, this is the effect of Europe on Africa in 1880. This is the control of Africa by Europe in 1913. Okay, so from all of these mint green areas are places where Europe has not gone in 1880, and by 1913, they're all controlled by Europe. Okay, so let's talk about how that happened exactly. Well, not exactly, but broadly how that happened. It starts with the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Now, y'all remember that the Ottoman Empire is like this whole area around the Mediterranean is controlled by the Ottoman Empire in the 1600s, right? It's creeping up on parts of Europe. Europe is holding its own against, we've got places, the city-states of Venice fighting with the Ottoman Turkish Emperor in Cyprus, on the island of Cyprus over here. So we've got a lot of influence of the Ottoman Empire. So everything that you see that's colored was the Ottoman Empire at one point, okay? In 1815, when the Treaty of Vienna ended the 7 Years' War, one of the things that got established was that all of the land that Russia had taken from the Ottoman Empire actually belonged to Russia now. That was one of those, I don't know if y'all remember, we talked about the Treaty of Vienna being a place where they drew borders around things and said, let's bring this back to being kingdoms that we recognize and stop all this populist uprising crap and put things back in the hands of our very autocratic monarchs, right? Then France became France with borders, and Europe and England had borders, and the US had borders. So they had just fought the French and Indian War. Well, Russia did too. They had established themselves as controlling this whole area here around the Caspian Sea. And then they had also taken Crimea. And then they had to give Crimea back, and the borders were given. In the 1850s, there was a war over Crimea, and Crimea managed to establish itself as an independent place. That's not going to last because we're still fighting over the Crimean. Right, but the point is that the Ottoman Empire no longer controlled it.
Hey, Mindy, you said that the Treaty of Vienna was the end of the 7 Years' War in 1815. Did you?
Yes.
Is that what I heard you say?
Yes.
Okay. I thought it was a lot earlier than that.
Well, okay. Hey, the Treaty of Vienna also ends, you're right, the Treaty of Vienna doesn't end the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Vienna ends the Napoleonic Wars. But the treaty that ended the 7 Years' War was the one where they drew all those really harsh borders. And then the Treaty of Vienna ended the Napoleonic Wars. So that's where they solidified the autocratic rulers. You're right.
Gotcha.
Okay. So anyway, the point is the Ottoman Empire is losing territory all throughout this century, from the 1770s to like, actually from earlier than that, but from the 1770s to 1914, the Ottoman Empire gradually crumbles over the course of several different events. The other thing that's happening is something we call the Great Game. We didn't call it that, they called it that, the British called it that. But from 1830 to 1895, Russia and Britain are fighting over Persia. And most of their fights center on Afghanistan. Mostly that's where they're fighting, is Afghanistan. So Russian troops invade and support tribal forces in Afghanistan and then pull back out. And then British troops invade and support tribal forces in Afghanistan and pull back out. This tug of war over a section of Persia that's really difficult to live in, but is so geographically important, because if you control Afghanistan, then you control trade into India. It's very difficult actually to trade into India over land if you don't control Afghanistan. And the only other way to get to India is to sail all the way around Africa.
That cat looks so mad.
Yeah, that's Persia. That's a Persian kitten. And this is the English lion and the Russian bear fighting over the Persian kitten. So I like that cartoon. That's funny. So the Great Game. Okay. So in 1859, a French merchant by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, and that clicked in my head because I was like, that's a name from a movie. And then I realized it's the name of the girl from Shakespeare in Love, but it doesn't matter. Ferdinand de Lesseps was a merchant from France who came up with the idea that all of this nonsense that's happening over here could be circumvented if there was just a waterway that went from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. If you could get from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, then you could just sail to India on the Red Sea. It would be easy, right? So he designed a canal system that would make it possible to get there, and that was the Suez Canal. He had it financed through merchant bodies in France, but then he went to Egypt, and Egypt provided most of the financing. Investors in Egypt, Egyptian investors, who are sort of falling out of the Ottoman Empire at this point. They managed to establish their actual sovereignty in like the 1870s, but at this point there are Egyptian residents who are trying to establish independence, so they finance it. The building of the Suez Canal takes about 10 years and costs about 120,000 lives. And eventually it becomes too expensive for the company that's financed by Egyptian investors. It actually becomes too expensive for them and costs all of the Egyptian government all kinds of money. And they eventually go bankrupt as a result. Their whole government, all of their merchant class kind of goes bankrupt as a result of trying to finance this project. At which point Britain swoops in. Britain sees controlling the power of the Suez Canal as critical to their holdings in India, because Britain's got lots of holdings in India. Britain has a lot of control over India. And as you can see, the way that they get to India is by sailing all the way around Africa. So they want control of this canal. So they buy all the shares, the bulk of the shares, from the Egyptians so that they can build the Suez Canal. So that they can control the Suez Canal, rather. In exchange for bailing out the financial problems that Egypt is having, they also ask if they can please take more control over the administration of Egypt. Since they're having financial problems and England is coming in to help them, could they also maybe control more of Egypt? So Egypt basically, who is still sort of attached and annexed by the Ottoman Empire, basically hands over a lot of their power to England in exchange for them finishing the Suez Canal and then controlling it, politely, like the English do. It's not like they're going to come in with troops and just, take over all of Egypt. And anyway, and what that does is that exposes England to once again being part of the slave trade. Now, England, by this point, long time ago, shut slave trade out of all of their territories. Like long before the Civil War in America, England had already illegalized slavery in all of their holdings. But now, because they're controlling a big chunk of Egypt, now they find themselves back into the middle of the slave trade. And so abolitionist societies in England take an interest in this. We need to figure out where the roots of, because slavery, this is just after the Civil War. It's just after the Civil War, or it's kind of in the middle of it. So technically, America no longer does international slave trade. They don't buy slaves from Africa anymore, legally, technically, because it's been illegalized in America. But somehow the slave population still persists. So it's not as lucrative as it used to be. So a lot of the slave trade in Africa is actually going up into Persia. It's going into the Arab-held places. So certain English parties start to ask themselves, what could we do to stop the spread of slavery out of Africa into Arab countries? And they have a lot of different theories. One of them is missionaries. If we Christianize the slaves, I mean, if we Christianize the villagers, then they won't be suitable to be taken as slaves. So they won't fit in the system anymore. So if we can just Christianize them, we can do that. David Livingstone, Dr. David Livingstone, Dr. Livingstone was a missionary and a cartographer and an explorer who went into Africa with the point of, he went in expecting to convert tribal people to Christians. He went all over the place, and he was there for 33 years and managed to convert one person. But he happened to be the chief of a tribe, and then he converted the rest of his tribe. So I guess, you know, it's a ripple effect that he managed to accomplish a little, but in his whole career, he only ever saw one person get converted to Christianity. So he decided that his best bet was to try to find the source of the Nile, because that was something that was really interest to the people of England, to find out the source of the Nile, which fed this big holding that they now administer, to chart Lake Victoria, which is named after the Queen, by the way. To chart the origins of the Nile was something that nobody had really done very effectively. And that invited him into societies in England. If he did it, then he got to give speeches. And in those speeches, he would say, let's talk about the evils of slavery. So that was the reason why he did it. He got lost, not lost, he disappeared during some of his exploration. But while he was an explorer, he was a hero to the people of England and America. He was like he was a celebrity, you know, he was a celebrity explorer. So when he vanished for a little while and nobody could find him, it was kind of a big deal. That's where this guy comes in. This is Sir Henry Morgan Stanley, who's actually John Rowlands. And this guy is a piece of work. I wish I had more time to talk about who this guy was, because this has to be one of the most gifted liars in history. This is a man who is Welsh. He landed in New Orleans, and shortly after arriving in New Orleans, he claims that he ingratiated himself to a man named Henry Pope Stanley, who was a wealthy merchant in New Orleans, and that man adopted him and made him his heir, and he traded on that inheritance to get himself financed for all kinds of things. Explorations into Africa was one of them, okay? Just to give you an example, this guy was hijacked by the Ottoman Empire at one point and talked himself out of being a prisoner. Like, he talked his way out of being a prisoner. He financed an expedition to go find Dr. Livingstone, and based on that encounter is according to his book, he walked into a village and he found Dr. Livingstone and he said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And Dr. Livingstone replied with, "Yes, and I am glad that I am here to greet you." And that was their whole relationship. He says it was very friendly, but he couldn't convince Dr. Livingstone to leave Africa and come back to England. So Dr. Livingstone ended up dying in the village he was in. And biographers who dug into the story have found out that, yes, actually the rich man did inherit a young man, or adopt a young man and make him his heir, but it wasn't this guy. Yes, Dr. Livingstone probably did eventually meet Henry Morgan Stanley, but wasn't impressed by him or anything. All of these things that came out in his story. Either way, he was able to talk himself into being financed over and over again. He decided he was romanced by King Leopold II. He was invited by King Leopold II, who had started a new the African Association, International African Association, for the purpose of philanthropy in Africa. And what he did was that he had conventions where he invited explorers to come and speak. So a little bit about King Leopold II. Leopold II is part of a new monarchy. Now, the other day when we were talking about monarchies and we traced all those family trees for like ever, remember, Belgium didn't even come up. The reason for that is because Belgian monarchy is something that didn't even exist until like the 1780s. And it was his father was the very first monarch of a new kingdom, which was the Kingdom of Belgium. So Leopold has a lot of pressure to establish Belgium as a competitive empire. So secretly what he wants to do is take a part of Africa and make it a new country that Belgium controls, okay? But that's not what he tells other people. What he tells, for example, this guy, what he tells Sir Henry Morgan Stanley is that what he wants to do is introduce inroads of civilization into the Congo and make it less appetizing for slave traders. So acts of philanthropy, or what he claims that this association is about. Leopold? He might not have thought he was lying. It's possible. You can look at the story of what happened with Leopold and you can actually make a case for it. He might have thought he was telling the truth. But anybody else with any reason and logic could have told him it wasn't going to work out that way. He figured that the Congo could be a place that had its own lucrative trade because they had products in the Congo, things like ivory that were very difficult to come by, and that if they became a rich source of those assets, then maybe they wouldn't be so tempting a target for slave traders. Okay, except that's not actually what he wanted to do, was establish his own new country, because Belgium is just this tiny little place at the top of Europe and is always in danger of being overrun by Germany. So having a whole separate country that also belongs to you was his goal. He contracted with Stanley for £1,000 a year to map the Congo, basically, to map the Congo and establish treaties, which Stanley did. He went into the Congo and he went tribe by tribe and he made what are called cloth and trinket treaties. Because you see, the tribal system, the way that it's set up in the Congo, doesn't have any system of land ownership. So if you come in there and say, we're going to leave your village here, but technically on paper, we're going to own the land you're sitting on, then to the tribal leaders, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter. You can't sell, they can't pick up the land and move it. They're going to let us stay here. What difference does it make if their name is on a lease somewhere? That piece of paper doesn't mean anything to us. So they sold that in exchange for somebody from Belgium bringing them a bolt of cloth once a month. Okay.
Wow.
Those are called cloth and trinket treaties, because it didn't mean anything to them. But as a result of that, little by little, Belgium began to own pieces of land in the Congo and find out what they were worth. Other European countries were nervous about this, so Leopold made promises to them. Leopold made a promise with Britain that if the Congo became a fruitful place, that he would that Belgium would offer most favored nation status to Britain, which meant that they would also have the ability to come in and purchase land the same way that they did. Then he turned around and told Germany that he had no intention of offering most favored nation status to anybody. So Germany, which wasn't one of the most favored nations, y'all remember the most favored nation treaty in China? Vaguely, right? Okay, so he promised most favored nation status to Britain, and then promised Germany not to give most favored nation status to anyone. And then promised France that if the Congo Association folded, if the Congo International African Association folded and was no longer able to finance any endeavors, that it would just revert to being owned by France. You see the problem right off the bat? Okay. He also got the US, who was raising concerns about this, to look at the Congo and told them, he told them, my project in the Congo is the same as your project in Liberia. I'm just trying to set aside a place that has, protected status and is owned by Africans. That's all we want, which is what Liberia was. It was a piece of land in Africa that the US had set up specifically to send freed slaves to so that they could have their own sovereignty. It didn't work out that way, but that's what Liberia was to begin with. And to everyone, Leopold said, don't worry, this is a charity organization. And it's not run directly by the Belgian government. It's a charity organization that's freestanding and is working on its own. So that is how he got control of the Congo. We'll come back to him in a minute, because one of the reasons why European countries didn't pay that much attention to what he was doing in the Congo is because they were busy with other things. In 1881, the Mahdi, which was a Muslim caliphate, which is a Muslim leader, from the Ottoman Empire, basically invaded into Egypt and tried to take control of Egypt again. And England rode into Egypt's defense and drove them out, finally, like definitively, drove them out over the course of several years. It took like from 1881 to like 1892 or something like that. It took a while. I'd have to look up the exact date. Somebody else can do it. But they're busy fighting this battle against the Mahdi so that they can take control of Egypt. And once they have done that, Egypt basically essentially becomes completely under England's control. So England is facing this uprising of the Mahdi and taking control of Egypt. At the same time, France is occupying Tunisia. And as a result of this, Italy self-defensively allies with Germany and Austria because Italy now feels surrounded. Have I got a map that I could show you that on? Okay, so this is Egypt. Tunisia is up here. French Algeria is already under control. I can do it this way. Yeah. Okay. So this is Egypt under the control of the United Kingdom. France has already taken control of Tunisia, which is up here. They already had control of French Algeria, which is how they kicked off the conflict that caused part of the. That was one of the things that had to be rectified in the Treaty of Vienna. Anyway, so everybody's kind of busy, and in the middle of this, the boot of Italy feels kind of surrounded by all these European countries. So it allies up north with Germany and Austria, which is what begins what's called the Triple Alliance, which might be important later, but we'll have to come back to it. And in the midst of all of this, Germany, which is, as you remember, a new empire under Otto von Bismarck, who is their prime minister, is trying to establish German control over the situation of all these countries. So Otto von Bismarck calls what's called the Congress of Berlin. And the Congress of Berlin invites world leaders from all over the place to talk about this situation in the Middle East and to talk about the decline of the Ottoman Empire, to talk about what's happening in Africa, and to make sure that Germany has a chance to actually have their feet wherever things are happening so that they don't get overrun by France and England and Russia. So at the Congress of Berlin, we established several things. First of all, we take this whole area away from the Ottoman Empire and divide it up into new countries: Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Serbia. These countries become not really sovereign exactly, but definitely separate from the Ottoman Empire. They give the Russian gains in the Crimea to Russia. So all of this area in the northern part of the Black Sea goes to Russia. And then Bosnia is annexed to this part of Bosnia right here, is annexed to Austria-Hungary. This is the borders of Greece are established. So Greece is sovereign and separate from the Ottoman Empire. Oh yeah, and as a side note, they also recognize the Congo Free State and give it to Leopold II of Belgium because he petitions for it at the Congress. They were there to meet about this, but while they're there and covering new business, Leopold says, can I have an official recognition of this area that I have purchased and that this now belongs, that it is its own place, Congo Free State, and it's under the administration of the Belgians? And the Congress of Berlin said, sure, that's fine. Okay.
I think he had some words issues in that one.
Huh? What?
Well, like gave the Russian gains in Crimea to Russia, or annexed Bosnia under and gave it to Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, you're right. I'll fix it.
No, it's okay. I'm sorry.
Gave the Russian gains in Crimea to Russia. So Russia had made gains in the Crimea, and the Congress of Berlin officially recognized those as belonging to Russia. But you're right about the second one. Under and gave it to is not right. There's a possibility I wasn't looking forward to making this PowerPoint, and so it's a little sloppier than I usually do. Okay, Bismarck himself wasn't actually, Bismarck of Germany, he wasn't actually in favor of aggressive colonization, but he did want Germany to have a foothold in Africa because everybody else did, essentially. So right after the Congress of Vienna, Germany moves in on Togoland, Cameroon, and Southwest Africa. Okay, so Germany starts to encroach on Africa just right after that. And this is a Bismarck at the Congress of Berlin cutting up the African cake is what that is, a cartoon of. It's a fairly famous cartoon. So now let's talk about what happened in the Congo. While everybody else is busy with everything else, here's what Leopold II's forces were actually. Now, Leopold II himself never actually went to the Congo. So to point at him and say, this is what Leopold did in the Congo is not entirely accurate. He set up the association, he set up the Congo Free State, and then he built a military, the Congo Free State under the association, which was a commercial enterprise, set up a military force called the Force Publique, whose job it was to enforce law in the Congo Free State. And in order to pay for all of this, the Congo Free State had to be productive. The two products that they had were ivory, which was available in lots of other places in Africa too, and rubber. Rubber in some places, like in Brazil and in India, grows in trees, and it is tapped from the trees, rubber trees. In the Congo, it grows in vines, okay? So in order to harvest it, what you have to do is that you have to slice the vine, slather it on your skin, let it dry like Elmer's glue, and then peel it off. That's the way you harvest rubber from vines. It takes the hair with it. Sometimes it takes a little bit of the skin with it. But this is how you harvest rubber, okay, in the Congo. A. B, you have to find the vines, which, given the fact that the Congo Free State, the Force Publique, set very high quotas, meant that it was more important for you to find rubber vines and harvest them than it was for you to plant food or hunt or take care of your children. And if you failed, the Force Publique came after you and enforced the quotas. This is why I don't like talking about this, because the penalty for not meeting your quota was death. Plain and simple. If the quota wasn't met from a village, then people in the village had to die, which you would think would cut down on the amount of labor available to meet the quota, but they didn't actually tend to kill the workers, they tended to just kill their families. So if you didn't meet the quota, there's a good chance one of your children would die. And to prove that they had killed who they said they were going to kill, they had to give a report, either you have this much rubber or you have this many people you killed. The way that they proved that they had killed them was to cut off a hand and bring the hand as a piece of currency. Are you with me so far? Do you wish you weren't? So harvesting hands became a whole separate enterprise from harvesting rubber on the part of the Force Publique, the military force. Harvested hands from villages so that they wouldn't have to chase down who was responsible for not meeting the quota. And in a lot of cases, they didn't even kill people to do it. So there's an entire generation of people from the Congo who are missing hands, or whose wives and children are killed and their hands are cut off and they're carried off. It becomes its own form of currency. This is arguably and again, death by injury from the rubber, death by famine and starvation, death by execution by the Force Publique. This was life in the Free State of Congo. Okay, this is a statue of King Leopold II in Africa. Every statue of King Leopold II that's still standing in Africa is always covered with red paint or blood. Sometimes it's actual blood, because the people there never want to forget what happened and how it happened. So there's no way to make that nice. I'm sorry. There's no way to talk about this without recognizing that we're talking about the deaths of about 20 million people, and long, painful deaths in most cases. Deaths by starvation, or death by exposure, or death by infection from the rubber, or death by the fact that they were bled out after their hands were cut off and they were left for dead. Either way, 20 million deaths in the Congo Free State for about 12 years. In 1899, novelist Joseph Conrad wrote Heart of Darkness. The book Heart of Darkness is a tough read, but if you take any English class in college, at some point somebody will tell you you have to read it. It's basically the story of an Englishman who goes into, English or American? I think it's an Englishman, who goes into Africa to find somebody who's gone missing, somebody who is supposed to be a manager of one of these enterprises, industrial enterprises. And he ends up riding up the river looking for it. And when he gets there, he finds out the guy who set himself up as sort of a god king, and it's complicated. The movie Apocalypse Now is based on the story of Heart of Darkness, but it takes place in Vietnam and has to do with Vietnam, US soldiers in Vietnam instead. But it's the same basic idea. On the way, on the journey, he sees all of the atrocities that are happening to these people, but the person who's actually telling the story, the narrative voice, is a Eurocentric racist voice. So he himself looks at it as, well, at least they're working, you know. So it's kind of cold, but what it does is it opens the door to people asking questions. What is happening over there? What are the Europeans actually doing in these African countries, and especially in the Congo? Edie Morel was, he worked on the docks in London, and he noticed that every time a shipment of rubber came into the docks, the same ships turned around and went back out, and all they ever had with them was arms and ammunition. And he began to investigate why that was. Huge shipments of rubber come in, and all that goes out are arms and ammunition. So that's all that's being shipped to the Congo. But what's being shipped from the Congo is rubber all the time. Okay? So he begins to investigate, and he begins to publish his investigation. And as a result, all of the European countries turn to Leopold and basically say, you have to take responsibility for this. The Belgian government has to be involved. This is no longer a private commercial enterprise anymore. You have to take responsibility for it. And so the powers that be, the European powers, basically forced Belgium to officially annex the Congo Free State so that it is now entitled to governmental control and responsible for what happens there to the people. But that's not what ends the atrocities in the Congo. What ends the atrocities in the Congo is that it becomes easier to get rubber from the trees in Southeast Asia. And also Leopold dies.
Oh.
So roughly 1908 is when all of this, the Congo Free State becomes the Belgian Congo. And this particular, all of these atrocious practices come to an end. But they don't really, because that whole area has always been sort of difficult. Yeah, it's always been, what happens in the vacuum is wars between tribal, and those, the atrocities that the force publique causes aren't limited to things that have to do with rubber. Sometimes they're just power hungry. They force people to do things to each other that we don't like to talk about because, you know, that keeps the population scared. It's intimidation tactic that keeps the population scared and subservient. So in a lot of ways, this is worse. I don't think you compare these things because it's not, but in a lot of ways, somebody who's kidnapped and enslaved in North America has a life that's forced on them in a place that's not their home. So there's always the possibility that things where they come from are still okay. Home is still a place where if they could only get back to it, it would be fine, you know, but they've been taken away from the place that they can. This is something that's happening to people in the place they live. This was a slavery that was enforced and horrifyingly carried out right in the place where they live. So in a lot of places, to me, it's worse. So anyway. Meanwhile, in 1890, Wilhelm II fired Otto von Bismarck for not being aggressive enough, basically. He was his father's man, really. His grandfather's man, because his father only actually had the throne for like a minute before he died. Wilhelm II had completely different ideas about the way he wanted Germany to be run. He wanted Germany's establishment as a colonial power to come from Germany actually being competitive. And so there were some other things going on. Wilhelm II had, I think I mentioned that he was born with a mutilated arm because of something that happened during his birth. And that always made him specifically competitive with his cousins in England. When his cousin took the throne in England, he became sort of, and then left him out of the whole, you know, dress alike day thing with the Tsar of Russia. Just left him out of that, and he could never really compete on their grounds. He began to try to reach for the things that were English. Prussian military is a land war thing. Prussians are very good at fighting on land. But Wilhelm II was always really jealous of the British Navy. The British Navy was always much stronger than anybody else's Navy. And so he believes that if he can build the Navy up, and this is based on a plan by Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the Tirpitz plan, if he can make the German Navy competitive with the British Navy, then the British will have to have an alliance with Germany because they won't be able to face off with them. Britain would never go to war with Germany if Germany has the same weapons as Britain. So why not build up the British Navy so that it is competitive with the, build up the German Navy so that it's competitive with the British Navy? And then also build up German colonies so that the German colonies are competitive with the British colonies. So basically he followed his cousin around like an angry board game or something and said, oh, you're moving there, well then I'm moving there. You're going to do this, well then I'm going to do this. And it happens for about 10 years. He pursues this really drastically. England begins to form alliances, so Germany starts to form alliances. And those alliances are often in direct opposition to each other. When England tries to annex Morocco, Germany goes to Morocco and supports Moroccan independence. I'm sorry, when France starts to, I'm sorry, I got befuddled. When France tries to annex Morocco, Germany goes to Morocco and supports Moroccan independence, supports the Sultan of Morocco, thinking that if France is challenged by the Sultan with German support, that France will just leave. But instead, and Britain won't act against Germany because at this point they're pretty much bros, right? They're equals, right? They've built up, they're equals. But weirdly, Britain decides to stand against the Sultan and Germany and stand side by side with France instead. Okay, so did you follow that triangle? France moves in on Morocco. Germany moves against France, thinking this will just be between us and the French because the British won't get involved because we're equals now. And then British makes a decision to stand against Germany in Morocco. So England's got its own thing going on. It's around this time, around the beginning of the 1900s, that Cecil Rhodes, who's an explorer in England, starts working in the Kimberley mines in Central Africa and little by little buys all of the diamond mines. Diamonds aren't particularly valuable at this point. They're nice, but they're not like the high value that they are. But he systematically buys all the mines until he owns all of them. And then he starts controlling the flow of diamonds until they become valuable. Yes, yeah, it's the beginning of that. But he has much bigger ambitions than that. He doesn't want to control the diamond industry. He wants to control Africa for England. He wants Africa to be under English control. His real goal is to build a railroad that goes from the Cape to Cairo, the Cape to Cairo Railroad. So he wants to build it this way. It never happens, but England roots for him in a lot of ways, roots for the project. He does establish Rhodesia, which is named after himself. Rhodesia, which is a country in Africa that's named after Cecil Rhodes. But the diamond trade finances a lot of railroad construction through Africa. It just never goes all the way from the Cape to Cairo. So that's how we get from 1880, when most of the continent was not controlled by Europe at all, to 1913, when it is all controlled by Europe. Okay, so this is Belgium, this is the Belgian Congo, this all is taken over by France. Here's the United Kingdom is Egypt and most of Cairo, but they can't get this part right here because Germany establishes itself as an interrupting force right here. Italy gets its pieces in here and there. This is part of Italy. The Italian boot is right about here. And then Ethiopia manages to retain its sovereignty, sort of. Okay, so any questions? No? Okay, so how many of y'all got to the reading? Did y'all do the reading, the Mark Twain reading? Because we have time to talk about it and we're going to. Okay, so under your class materials for the other day, under the new imperialism, I gave you The Person Sitting in Darkness. Now, this is written about a slightly different situation because Rudyard Kipling is writing about the white man's burden. Because America's on its own quest for imperialism. America's starting to set up imperial holdings in the Philippines, but it all kind of links into the same thing. The Western European white people nations trying to annex the places that are not in, like the places that are in Europe and Asia, or Africa and Asia. So Rudyard Kipling writes The White Man's Burden in 1899. In other words, this comes out at the same time that Heart of Darkness came out. So this is after what's been going on in the Congo has been going on for a while. This is after all that. He takes, send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captive needs. This is the poem that he writes. Where is it? This is Mark Twain's answer to that. Extending the blessings of civilization to our brother who sits in darkness has been a good trade and has paid well on the whole. What is he talking about when he's talking about extending the blessings of civilization? No, the blessings of civilization.
He's being sarcastic.
All right, but what is he being sarcastic about exactly? What are supposedly supposed to be the blessings of civilization?
Well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
But it's really about the money.
Christianity, modernization, modern transportation, education, the ability to come down out of the trees and stop living in the jungle like a bunch of savages, which is one of the reasons why I think everybody should read at least the beginning part of Heart of Darkness, or not Heart of Darkness, but the response to Heart of Darkness. Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart by Chibi. Has anybody read that? Have you ever heard of it? No? Okay. That was an answer to Heart of Darkness. He basically wrote that because he wanted the other side of the story to be told. And the whole beginning of that book takes place before there's any kind of missionary happening, any kind of missionary work happening. So it's just from the perspective of the African villagers. And their system of life is so sophisticated. Their system of life is, you've read it, Casey? No? Okay. The idea that what's happening over there before the Europeans get there is savage is laughable. I mean, when you actually look at the life that most of these people have, they fight with each other, they have tribal wars, but they're not savages, they're villages with systems of organization and everything. So you need to read this. I think one of your exam essay questions is actually about this. So you need to read this. But
I think it was listed Karl Marx.
okay, I believe you.
Yeah. You had it up for a minute.
I had it up for a minute and you peeked. Cheating, Jordan. My goodness.
I'm using the resources given away.
Okay. All right. So you're going to need to read this. But what we want to think about here is that Leopold specifically sold his ability to go into the Congo on the basis that he was doing a charitable act. And that charitable act was to bring the light of civilization into the dark of the Congo. So what light of civilization could he possibly have been offering to the people that were already living there, when what he actually brought them was death and starvation? What was it that he was trying to sell himself as bringing? What was the light of civilization that he was actually trying to bring? What good does it do for these countries?
To be able to trade with other countries.
These countries that are all mint green ones in 1880, what good does it do them to be under the control of Europe? What's the benefit to them? Because the people of Europe believed there was one.
They created their own as well.
It's an interesting question. And it would be nice to say, boy, that was a weird period of history where people thought that they could go into a country and change it for the better by imposing their own culture. You know what we still do? We still do that. So it's an important thing to know. Okay, that's as much as I can do on this. I don't even really, the amount that I actually showed you in class represents an immense amount of reading that I wish I hadn't had to do. So y'all have any thoughts about any of this?
Did you ever read King Leopold's Ghost?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say yes, I did read King Leopold's Ghost.
How did he die?
I think he was just sick.
He was
He was really quite old. Somebody Google it. How did King Leopold die? Thank you, Jordan. That way I don't have to. Okay, I'm going to stop this share so we can have a class discussion instead. But oh, look at all the cameras off. Okay, for just a few minutes, we'll just talk about our thoughts about all of this. So next week after the test is over, we're going to be in World War I. How does all of this, going back to the beginning of the semester, how does all of this set up for World War I? What's happening We started off the semester talking about the Mediterranean and how control of the Mediterranean was so important. What has just happened to all of the properties around the Mediterranean? It's going to set us up for a war,
Well, the Ottoman Empire.
right? The Ottoman Empire has collapsed. That's
All these
true.
people are creating allies with each other.
Uh-huh. I don't think it does me any good to point the camera at anybody.
You know, he just died of old age, 24.
Yeah, he just died comfortable and old in his bed.
But apparently in 2010, a Belgian member of the European Parliament called him a visionary hero.
Uh-huh.
And everybody was like, no, he was genocide.
He was a genocidal maniac, except he wasn't a genocidal maniac. He was a businessman who was trying to establish sovereignty. He himself was,
He probably didn't know all of that.
okay, but y'all remember that Machiavelli wrote this book once called The Prince, which said that the ends justify the means. So if he had to carve a path to lighten civilization through a people that was already in the Congo, so that the Congo in the center of Africa could be this Belgium kingdom that was all light and civilization in order to get there. And to finance it, he had to use the assets that were there, and harvesting those assets happened to be a little tricky and costly in lives, but his end goal was that in the middle of this dark continent, that there would be a kingdom of European values.
Yeah, because they didn't start making statues of him in the Congo until the 30s.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's like,
And that's a whole separate problem. But okay, I mean, you can look at it from the perspective of the prince, the Machiavellian, ideology, and say, if it had gone the way he thought it was going to go, then the Congo would have been a European country in the middle of Africa that was trading locally made goods with the rest of the world at great value, and then light of civilization spread out from that to the rest of the Congo.
but that's not the case.
That's not what happened, but to say that he went in there with the intention of being a homicidal maniac kind of doesn't really do justice to the real homicidal maniacs. Because his intention wasn't to kill Africans. His intention was to change Africa. It just happened to cost a lot of African lives to do it. And then it didn't work because that doesn't work.
It's kind of like the Stanford prison experiment.
Okay, you want to elaborate?
Well, they did an experiment to show that people are innately, if you give them power
Mhm.
for other people, they will innately act horrible. So the Stanford prison assignment was they had college volunteers, and they broke them up. Half of them were going to be guards,
Uh-huh.
the other half were jails. And they put them in jail, and they ran this for like a month or something, and they started beating the crap out of the inmates. 'Cause they
Right, that if you
do
give,
whatever
if you
want.
take a group of people and you give them power over the minutia of the lives of another group of people, that power will be abused, which is what the fourth public did. They abused their power.
How many of the guards were making chat or drinking?
All right, Zoom, y'all need to chime in here. You need to give us your thoughts on this situation. Where'd y'all go?
Because that was the first public was one of the first real instances of the Africans doing that, or them giving authority to Africans. That's at least written, right?
Brooklyn?
Back to the Stanford thing, the Stanford prison experiment.
Okay,
Didn't they only use white guys?
I think so. No, I think there was some brown, some Hispanic,
Okay.
but they didn't use black.
okay.
But they still, I think they had to end it early because people were getting so abused.
Yeah, you want to kind of stop things like that before it gets to that point, but anyway. Okay, all right, so Zoom is, y'all joining us from Zoom aren't gonna join in this conversation, huh?
Hey,
Yeah.
Mindy,
Yes.
it's Sam. I'm curious, what were they using rubber for in the 1890s?
Bicycle tires,
Oh, okay.
all tires, actually, all vehicle tires were made. Synthetic rubber hadn't been invented yet.
So wait a minute. If you fall off your bike and skin your knee, is that revenge?
Sure, we'll go with that, except that your bike doesn't have rubber from the Congo on it. Your bike has.
No, I
something.
mean like back
Yeah, rubber is now made out of oil, so this whole harvesting things from rubber trees and harvesting things from rubber vines. But yeah, in the early 1800s, bicycles were adapted to use rubber tires because India had rubber. So somebody, I can't, his name starts with an N and I knew it earlier, but invented the rubber tire for the bicycle. And then that really made things take off with the whole bicycle tire industry. And then rubber began to be used for other things. It was just, balls bounce because they're made of rubber, so it was just bouncing balls and stuff, and it wasn't that big of an industry. But then,
Yeah, they were predominantly white and middle class.
yeah. So, yeah, that's what they were using it for.
They excluded the whole background.
Tires of the original one dime.
Kinda. I mean, tires on vehicles weren't rubber for a long time because there just isn't enough rubber in the world until synthetic rubber was invented in Texas,
Because oil,
which is a whole different lecture that I give in.
they needed to
Cultural
try to
history,
make
Texas.
oil profitable.
They found oil and didn't know what to do with it, so they invented things that use oil. And one of the things they invented was synthetic rubber, which then kicked off the entire, everything now has rubber tires industry. So it's now made out of oil. So
Like a clam bake.
yes. Yeah, believe it or not, there was a time in history where if you discovered oil on your land, you were like, oh man, this land is ruined. Stupid
Now it's
oil
like, we're
reserve,
millionaires.
stupid dinosaurs. Anyway. So, all right, well, that's where I'm going to end it then. I will take a few